for it, ride for it. I'ma organize for it. Stay up in the night and in the morning, I'ma rise for it. Heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it, peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it. Work for it, ride for it, I'ma organize for it. Stay up in the night and in the morning, I'ma rise for it. Heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it, peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it. I want to introduce to the Money, Power, Land Solidarity podcast a really special guest, Waziyatawin, a Dakota scholar, teacher, and activist. I first encountered the book, What Does Justice Look Like? It had a profound impact on my life, a history of Minnesota, and a concrete program and plan and some real thoughts around decolonization. Our podcast, we started the show because we were wrestling with this project, the Upper Harbor Terminal. It's 48 acres of land between the Lowry Avenue Bridge and the Camden Bridge in North Minneapolis. Have you spent a lot of time in Minneapolis?
You know, not a lot of time. I went to school at the University of Minnesota, so during my undergraduate experience, I was in the cities. But that was, I guess, the last time I lived there, and so I've never been real familiar with North Minneapolis or that section.
I see. Yeah, that's where I grew up. I grew up in Northeast Minneapolis, and there's a complicated history between Northeast and North Minneapolis. But I spent a lot of time right on that land. So we were wanting to talk about all the implications of this development, you know, gentrification, the rise in inequality and poverty in the Twin Cities, and the idea that this is 48 acres of public land, city-owned land, that the city has chosen to work with the wealthiest white families in Minnesota, the Polads, to give exclusive rights to develop this piece of land. And it has so many consequences, and it relates so much to the way our economy works. So I wanted to just see if we could talk about that project a bit in the context of settler colonialism. So just to start with, I was hoping, could you talk about the relationship of the Dakota people to the land that is now the state of Minnesota? What's the historical relationship with this landmass, this land base, and what is the relationship today?
Well, we consider the place that we call Minnesota Makoche, or land where the waters reflect the skies, to be the ancient homeland of our people. And when I say our people, I'm referring specifically to Dakota people, but also Lakota and Nakota peoples. We all comprise the larger Dakota Oyate, and our Oyate is composed of 7 campfires. And at one time, all of those 7 campfires would have been in Minnesota Makoche at various points in our history. But I was raised with a particular story about the creation of Dakota people at the junction of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers at that place we call Brote. And so I would say our relationship to this area goes all the way back to the very beginning, to the first human presence in this part of what's now called North America.
In your book, that was the first time I encountered that truth. You know, I had vague ideas of like indigenous people, and I knew Native people all my life, but never understood that this was the origin place for Dakota people. And then also learned a more honest history about what happened here, how the land was stolen. Could you talk a bit about, you know, what has the state of Minnesota and the capitalist economy meant for the Dakota people? How was the land dispossessed?
Yeah, there's a lot to that question, I guess.
Yeah, I'm even asking it honest because I don't want to. How do you bring something of such magnitude up? You know.
Right. And so I can give you kind of a brief outline of some of the major things that happened. But one of the points I think that's really important for people to understand is that what happened to Dakota people in terms of our relationship with our homeland was not an accident. It was not an unfortunate incident or an unfortunate event. It was part of the larger American colonial imperial project. And it happened to Indigenous peoples all over these lands. So from the time that Europeans first came into our territory, it was with the intent that eventually they would take it over. And everyone who came here came with that understanding that, like on the East Coast, where Indigenous populations had already been displaced, had already had wars of extermination perpetrated against them, the same thing would be repeated throughout what's now the United States. So it was no accident. And so, like other Indigenous populations, we had our lands invaded. We negotiated treaties with the federal government in the hope that we would be able to retain some small part of our homeland and be left alone, without more conflict. And at every juncture, we were met with this, the oppressiveness of the colonial relationship, of the colonial reality. In 1862, our people went to war against the United States government and its citizens because it was the people who were occupying our homeland who were the face of the United States government to us. And they were the ones who were affecting our everyday lives. So we saw around that same time kind of a rapid depletion of the game in our areas, the animals that we relied on for our sustenance. There was constant encroachment onto our reservation lands, even though those lands were supposed to be protected for our use. And there was constant pressure from government agents and missionaries to change our way of life to fit the American model of how to be, how to eat, how to pray, how to think, how to relate to the land. All of those things were under major transformation at that point. And it wasn't just about some kind of cultural exchange. It wasn't about sharing white American values or Christian values with Dakota people, and Dakota people voluntarily picking those patterns of behavior and those ways up. This was about Americans and Christians trying to eradicate every aspect of our way of life, every aspect of our culture that made us who we were and that tied us to our homeland. And the purpose of that, I believe the ultimate purpose, was always about taking the land. It was always about being able to exploit the resources. And the reason why it was so necessary to break down our culture and who we were as a people was so that we would not resist that, so that we would not fight to protect the land, so that we would allow the exploitation and occupation of our homeland without a struggle. And so the efforts to break down our culture were relentless.
I think you put it in the context in your book to understand that that's a part of genocide, cultural genocide. The idea of removing somebody's worldview and cultural practices was a part of this broader project that does meet the internationally recognized standards for genocide. And that's something that the powers that be, white Minnesota, doesn't want to tell that truth or use that word in this context when there's no other way to understand it.
Right, exactly. And the more that I think about it, or as I get older and, am really working to recover Dakota practices and Dakota ways of being, the more I believe that it's that cultural extermination that was even more harmful than the physical extermination, because it's really hard a population can recover if they've suffered physically in some way, but it's much more difficult to recover from a cultural viewpoint if there have been systematic attempts to eradicate who you are. So it's insidious. So after our war, we suffered the loss of our homeland. Our population was forcibly removed from the state of Minnesota. Bounties were placed on our scalps starting at $25 in the spring of 1863, and eventually by that fall reaching $200. And so there was an incentive for white settlers within the state to actually participate in that extermination process directly. But the idea was to strike such terror into the hearts and minds of Dakota people that we would never dream of returning to our homeland. And so after 1863, there were a couple small pockets of Dakota people, and I'm talking like a couple dozen Dakota people, but the rest of our population was forcibly removed from our homeland. And it wasn't until the later in the 19th century that our populations began returning again in very small groups to our homeland. And, today we have 4 small reservations within the state of Minnesota, and we occupy what I figure to be about 12 thousandths of 1% of our original land base, while most of our people still live in exile. Most of our people have no claim to land here, and most of our people, I should say, according to Settler Society,
right,
because in my mind, we all have a claim to this land. But most of our people have never been able to have a relationship with our homeland like our ancestors did. And in 1863, the United States government unilaterally abrogated the treaties with our people. And what that means, if you think about a treaty as a contract between 2 parties, if one party abrogates that agreement or decides it's no longer wants to participate in that contract, normally things would revert to the pre-contract status. And what happened in this context was that the United States government, not only did they not pay Dakota people for the land according to the treaties, but they also kept the land. So they kept the land and the money. And that's why when I talk about land theft in this context, that's what I mean, that even when lands were negotiated by treaty, and I will say all of the treaties negotiated with the Dakota were extremely fraudulent and controversial, but even those kind of measly terms of the treaty were violated, and in the end, the United States got everything and Dakota people got nothing within our homeland. And that to me is outright land theft. It's legalized land theft, but it's that's how the land was wrested away from us.
yeah.
So we're living with that legacy now.
You talk about in the book the need for deep truth telling. You tell a history, and then you talk about the need to engage that history in honest ways. And I think this project, I'm hoping we want to do our part with this podcast to engage in that deep truth telling about what actually happened on this land and who's profited from it. Can you just kind of talk about that need for truth telling, why it plays such a role in the book? I know you bring up other contexts like South Africa and even European contexts where genocide has occurred. I was just wondering if you could speak on that truth-telling process, the need for it, and then hopefully what would flow from that truth-telling process.
Why truth-telling about this is so important is because in words like genocide, ethnic cleansing, land theft, always, I guess, strike a really painful chord in the minds and hearts of people. And it evokes a strong reaction, I guess. And when it's acknowledged that a population has suffered from genocide, for example, it's very difficult to argue that they don't deserve some kind of justice or that something should be done. Or if there's been a monumental crime like the stealing of a people's homeland, if you acknowledge that, if you admit to that, then it demands some kind of action. It's hard to say, oh, gee, that's too bad. That rings so hollow and empty.
It's something that I've really been experiencing. I started to notice it in like the 2017 municipal elections when folks were running for city council And I do a lot of community organizing work that focuses on the Minneapolis parks and the park board. And you could see, I think, probably because of always just because of pressure, that there started to be land acknowledgments before meetings, and even now sometimes with this Upper Harbor Terminal process, you'll get somebody from the city who will stand up at the beginning of a meeting and say, well, first, before we start, I want to acknowledge that we're on stolen Dakota land. And then just completely plows forward as if that statement has no implications, and you don't see any serious changes in policy priorities. The rest of the meeting doesn't look any different than if he wouldn't have made that land acknowledgement.
Right.
So that was really one of the experiences I was continuing to have that made me want to reach out to you, because I feel like if you heard that if somebody was earnest in making a land acknowledgement before a public meeting, what could be some next steps from there? What should happen after that? And both, if you have any responses to that question, and then also I'd like to from there talk about also the way you describe reparations and even like some sequence in terms of which land could be returned in which order. So I just want to kind of to move in that direction. So to simplify that a bit, if what should happen after somebody makes that type of land acknowledgement in a meeting?
Right. Well, I agree that that can be an empty gesture. It was, I guess, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago when I started to see different efforts to rename places or bring back Dakota names or to acknowledge Dakota, that this is Dakota Homeland. And initially, they didn't even acknowledge that the land was stolen. So I would say that recognition is important. It's an important distinction from just saying this is Dakota Homeland. But I remember maybe it was more like 7 or 8 years ago, locally here, I'm from the Upper Sioux Reservation in southwestern Minnesota. And in this area, somebody had reached out to me with one of the local parks, and they wanted to have used the Dakota name on the signage there as an acknowledgement that this is Dakota Homeland. And, they wanted help with a translation, with the language for it. And I asked them at the time, I said, is this a park that, Dakota people can occupy, that we'll have greater access to? And the answer was no. No, they just want the signage.
Yeah.
And I said, no, I'm not going to help you with that, because there wasn't any follow-up. It didn't have any meaning other than to make them kind of feel, I guess, better, or it felt like kind of a trendy thing, or part of maybe a white liberal feel-good project that has no real benefits to Dakota people or to Indigenous people more broadly. And so I'm kind of wary of some of those efforts. And one thing I do know is that I would like to see that affect the whole conversation from that point forward, because in pretty much any discussion that happens in the United States, if you bring in the Indigenous perspective, it disrupts everything. It changes everything, because it's hard to talk about, and you mentioned this before too, about public spaces, for example. What does that mean in the context of settler colonialism? And so I would like to see an engagement all the way through about the meaning of that. In more concrete ways, I think that it's important for follow-up. It's important to say, if we're acknowledging that this land was stolen, what's the right thing to do here?
Yeah.
It's not, putting up a sign and saying that. Again, that has no benefit to our people who are living in exile and don't have a homeland to come back to, because they don't have a land base. So what are the logical next steps? And those are the questions that I try to raise whenever I'm approached about either participating or helping with those kind of land acknowledgements.
Yeah, that's a really important insight. And I feel like it is the next step where I do think there's some positivity that it's even raised to the surface that people are now naming, what happened in a certain way. And I feel like that's where we have to follow that call for deep truth telling, where when people are in the meetings is to challenge folks to take the next step and to not allow people to just, for it to become this white liberal kind of check the box and now we can move on type of thing. And unfortunately, that's what it feels like in most of the contexts where I see it practiced, especially I'm thinking of, spaces facilitated by the city or by some of the more white-led nonprofits.
So, especially with some of these lands, from my perspective, land is key. Land is the key issue. That the whole colonial project in the United States is about acquiring indigenous land and exploiting indigenous resources, and so. Land is central, I guess, to any conversation about trying to right some historical wrongs.
Right.
And you had asked about, how that might proceed, or what are some of those next steps. And when I talk about the small land base that Dakota people have within the state of Minnesota today, nobody says, "Oh, that should be enough land." 12 thousandths of 1%, that's good enough.
Yeah.
It's hard to make that argument. And so, I've considered, what could be done, and a lot of white settlers get very uncomfortable when we start talking about land return, because they think that we're going to be going after their family farms or their family homes, and you start to hear them say things like, "Well, my family's been here for 4 generations, and we love this land, and and we're connected to this land," and that's not the conversation I'm interested in having. But I have talked about the return of some of the public lands, the state lands, the county lands, municipal lands, tax forfeited lands. And in Minnesota, we have more than 11 million acres of public lands that could be returned to Dakota people today or tomorrow without touching a single acre of privately held land. So there's a huge opportunity to do the right thing and restore a land base to Dakota people within the state of Minnesota, but it's hard to get movement in that direction, and it to I guess discuss how that might happen. It means giving up something.
Yeah.
That Indigenous people, we gave up our homeland so that all of these cities, so that Minneapolis could exist, so that St. Paul could exist, so that every town and every county within the state of Minnesota could exist. We gave up something. And the only way to right that is for settlers to give up something now to help repair that injustice. And it's been astonishing to me in some of the conversations, if I talk about, say, the return of Minnesota state parks to Dakota people, immediately people start going to, their memories of being in their local state parks and what those parks mean to them. And they don't want to give that up. Their recreation, in fact, becomes more important than justice, than our Dakota relationship with our homeland. And so you start to see how defensive people get, and how they kind of support justice as long as they don't have to give up anything. And that's not how this works, especially if you're trying to work towards some semblance of decolonization. But it's one of the reasons why after my book, What Does Justice Look Like, came out in 2008. It was in 2009. It was a group of settler allies and I who were having a conversation about how do we work towards land return. And at the time, they said, "Well, have you ever thought about buying back some of that land?" I said, "Well, yeah, certainly we have. And in fact, all of our Dakota reservations in the state of Minnesota have bought back some of our stolen land so that they can increase the reservation land base. But even so, we still have such a tiny fraction of 1% of our original land base." And from my perspective, because I was interested in justice, us buying back the land that was stolen from us in the first place does not represent justice. It only adds to the list of injustices as far as I'm concerned. So they said, well, what if we raised money to buy back land and then we turned it over to you so that Dakota people could use it to live? And I thought that would work, but I didn't think it would happen. I thought, what settlers would actually contribute to a land buyback project for Dakota people? Like who's interested in that? Well, they started fundraising and they contributed to our nonprofit. And 10 years later, in 2019, the nonprofit we have, it's called Makoche Ikikchupi, which we translate as land recovery. We purchased our first small parcel of land here in Granite Falls, Minnesota, in the Minnesota River Valley, which is part of our traditional territory, 21 acres. And it's not a lot, but it's 21 acres more than I thought we would ever get through such a project. And hopefully it's just the first among many that will be forthcoming. But this was a way for settlers to, in a very concrete way, contribute to land justice beyond rhetoric, beyond land acknowledgement. It was a way that they can help us in a very concrete way.
Is there a way that we can link that in the show notes so that folks who are listening to this can click on that and put some money up?
Absolutely. I can send you the link. It's basically makoche.ikikchupi.com. But I will send a link to you.
I would be happy to share that. That's an interesting perspective. It leads me to some of these other questions and kind of dynamics I wanted to hear your perspective on. And it's kind of around economics. I guess that's a practice of cooperative economics, and then economics with the political intention of decolonizing and land return. I'm curious if you have any thoughts or experience on the relationship between the Indigenous perspective you're organizing as a Dakota person for reclamation and decolonization, and then I guess what is the left of settler society. I do this podcast and I say explicitly on here that I'm a socialist, a communist of some variety, that I'm anti-capitalist. And a part of looking at this Upper Harbor Terminal development is to seriously question the capitalist assumptions of, like, why would the city of Minneapolis turn over more land that is now public to the wealthiest white people in the country? Really, these are billionaires. And then, like you said, I'm really learning and understanding again that when you bring the Indigenous perspective to the table, it challenges my political assumptions, where, if you get into a socialist rhetoric, the idea of like keep the land public, as if that's enough, or as if that's a neutral statement, and that public in the settler colonial context is different. So I guess that's a long-winded introduction to hear, like, what do you think are the opportunities for solidarity between maybe the left? There's like a resurgent socialist movement in the United States and organized Indigenous people. Do you think there is? Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that there is opportunity as long as that settler-colonial relationship is always at the forefront of the discussion and the collaboration or decision making. I'm also anti-capitalist, and I'm anti-industrial civilization. I have a lot of concerns about the impact of capitalism. Any paradigm, I guess, based on the premise of unlimited growth and unlimited exploitation, that we live on a finite planet with finite resources, and we can't simply continue to exploit life, everything that we need to survive, the soil, the water, the air, basic things that all life requires. So if we want to live, we have to shed those that constant exploitation. We have to stop it. And the whole idea of public space. I've had similar conversations with people who have been kind of promoting the commons or the idea of the commons, because all of those conversations usually happen without an Indigenous perspective. And when you talk about public land, of course, it's Indigenous land that our people are still being denied on a
Right.
daily basis, because settler colonial society can exclude us, and can keep us off the land. And, and it affects every aspect of our lives. And, Americans really believe in a sense of freedom to do whatever they want. And, real basic freedoms are denied our people and are denied most people in this country, but they're not the things that settlers tend to value. I think about clean water, clean air, good soil, the foundations of life. Those things are all in danger right now. They're all in jeopardy within the state of Minnesota. They're all in jeopardy for all, the entire population, not just Indigenous people. And clearly, if actions are an indication of values, then those are things that the society does not value. And you can't live indefinitely with I guess values that destroy what you need to live. And as Dakota people, one of the things I often say is that it's illegal for us to be Dakota in Dakota Homeland. And so while Americans value whatever sense of freedom they perceive they have, from the Dakota perspective, anytime we try to be Dakota, we bump up against the law. And just to give you an example, I mentioned that our nonprofit purchased these 21 acres in Granite Falls, and we're in the process of constructing Dakota earth lodges, which is one of our traditional forms of housing, but it's been more than 2.5 centuries since Dakota people actually lived in earth lodges. The last ones that I know that we lived in were around the Mille Lacs area of Minnesota around the 1750s. So we decided we're going to revive this building practice, this housing practice, to establish what we hope will be a culturally oriented and sustainable community. And this fall, we were issued a stop work order by the local city government because we were not in compliance with Minnesota state building codes. So even in this case, we're buying back land that was stolen from us. We're just trying to practice our culture, revive one of our old building practices, and we're bumping up against the law. And so this spring, we're having to try to get legislation passed with the Minnesota state government that will exempt Indigenous people from practicing Indigenous building. And it's something that it upsets me that we even have to do that. But if we don't, we'll be criminalized, that we will be threatened with fines, with court orders and with jail if we don't eventually comply. And so our behavior is always highly criminalized when it doesn't comply with settler society's rules and regulations or values. And we see that over and over again.
Yeah. Oh, it's just a shame. I preparing for this interview, I listened to a lecture that you gave, I think pretty recently, and you talked about the process of choosing the materials for your home and the earthen homes, and really the dynamic that you were wrestling with in terms of the serious work of survival. That's the political work in this context of actually creating a sustainable lifestyle. And then also feeling like you couldn't completely disengage from political life and life off of that piece of land. Could you talk about that dynamic at all? Like what it's been like for you to dive into that process of creating that community, and then that taking you away from public life in a sense? And then how do you think about, I guess what I'm trying to articulate also is that I was really challenged listening to your lecture in what felt like a very clean and healing way, because I realized that I was kind of deluding myself with a socialist rhetoric that was still taking industrial society as a assumption, even if like nominally critical of it, and just feeling terrified for my future in a sense, in terms of if I don't create another way to get my food, another way to live that's not dependent on this destructive system, really will we be able to have another generation, you know? So wondering, like, am I wasting my time by doing this political education work, by doing this political organizing? Is it just another kind of delusion? Or, but then to think that, like you say, to control political engagement still seems like one of the ways where we might be able to defeat this system, or part of the overall picture. So I was just wondering, could you speak on that dynamic at all, like your political engagement versus your kind of survival work with your family?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have to do both. It's really hard to disengage completely because we're always drawn in. And so, I definitely understand the pull to stay engaged. And, it's like now the last thing I want to be doing is working toward passing legislation, which I've never done before.
Yeah.
I have no experience doing it, but it's out of necessity because I don't want to end up in jail before we get to
Right.
get to put into practice our dream or our vision for this land base. And so I persist. I do both, but that it is difficult. When I think since I gave that lecture, I divorced and remarried and building another earthen structure, but my husband now and I built a earth lodge on the Enemy Swim on the Lake Traverse Reservation in South Dakota, and we finished that in September of 2018, where we were able to move in. So I'm back and forth between there and Upper Sioux, and really trying to experiment with sustainable living in the 21st century context, and for Indigenous people. It's not like we can simply pick up the ways of our ancestors because so much has changed. We have a homeland now that's been toxified. We have very limited resources because so much of, for example, the forests have been destroyed. Water is always an issue, and access to good water and contamination from farmers' fields and pesticides and fertilizers and all of those things are all part of our reality. So it's always a balancing game, it feels like, or it's always about compromise. But I really believe that all of us need to shed some of the foundational myths of American society. And I think one of those myths is the myth of progress and another myth is the myth of social evolution. And those ideas are deeply embedded in the American psyche, where we believe that things are going to get better and better, things are going to advance. What does that mean? It means, technological advancement. And there's another myth about the neutrality of technology. And all those myths are very harmful because they I guess disguise the real dangers to us and allow us to I guess push aside everything that doesn't fit within that paradigm. But what we do know is that industrial civilization is destroying the planet. It's it's led to climate change and the climate catastrophe that indigenous populations in other parts of the world are already experiencing. And we're already feeling the effects of it. So it's here. And if we don't take dramatic action to put an end to our use of fossil fuels, we're just going to continue to accelerate down this path of destruction. So, I've heard my whole life, people would tell me, especially as an Indigenous person, you can't go back. And, in some ways, that's correct. Like I mentioned, in terms of how our homelands have been destroyed, we're going to have a much harder time living sustainably, and even harvesting enough food for sustenance because of the destruction to our homeland. That's the reality that we have to live in today. But on the other hand, and in a much more profound way, a much more significant way, going back is the only path forward. It's the only path forward because it's the only way that's sustainable over the long term. If you want your children, your grandchildren, your great-great-grandchildren to have a possible life, we're going to have to change these ways. And we're going to have to revert back to, I guess, a worldview that's not based on exploitation, but it's based on relationships and supporting life, all life, plant life, animal life, the integrity of the water, the integrity of the air, the integrity of the soil. All of those things are extremely important and indispensable to living. So, in my mind, when people say or try to tell me now you can't go back, that's absurd to me, because what I know about their path is that's going to lead to extinction. And in my mind, that's insanity.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's really bizarre sometimes I go to a lot of these meetings that around the Upper Harbor Terminal that the city convenes or the developer convenes, in the insanity of capitalism and industrial society, and the way these people get up and talk about their projected economic growth and how the land is going to appreciate in value and what it's going to look like, as if the scientific consensus is not impending ecological disaster, and as if we're not on the precipice of just collapse, and that it's not urgent action to move differently. And these are the people who get taken very seriously, and when you sometimes it's the dissonance between what is considered like the norm or like reality in those spaces, as opposed to when you step away and from a realistic perspective look at what's happening around the globe. It's jarring almost. And I think that's why it's important to have these conversations, because I would leave those meetings and just feel so incredibly frustrated that it's all like a kayfabe, like professional wrestling, everybody just pretending like it's reality when it's not.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you can start to feel like you're crazy.
Certainly, yeah.
People are living in a different alternative reality that's not based in truth. It's not based on real life, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Maybe I'll just close up by bringing it back to the land. This development is on the Mississippi River, and the Mississippi River, I grew up in Northeast Minneapolis. That was where we would go, like with my mom and dad or anybody. Like, it was a free place to go, and it really is like in my heart. Could you talk about your relationship with the Mississippi River? Have you spent a lot of time on the Mississippi? Does the Mississippi have, obviously it's a part of the creation story, but if you could just speak on the Mississippi River from your perspective, what it means to you.
Yeah, the Mississippi River, in Dakota, we called it Chachawakpa, and it's the river of falls, but it's it's like a major vein running through Mother Earth, within our homeland. And our lives as Dakota people, or Oceti Sakowin people, I should say, we're always along the rivers, always along the waterways. And so we see the Mississippi as a central part of our lives. And unfortunately, because of Minnesota's ethnic cleansing policy, most of our population has been disconnected from the river for the last, more than a century and a half now. There's one of our reservation communities, the Prairie Island Reservation, that is still along the Mississippi River. And so they have a daily relationship with the river in a way that other Dakota people do not. So I think it's one of the the examples of heartbreak for our people, feeling that disconnection, not being able to collect water, to fish, to pray, or have ceremony along the river, to travel to see relatives, to interact with the water on a daily basis. That's something that we feel the loss of, I guess. And so what I would say is that you are very fortunate to be
Absolutely.
able to have that relationship with the water.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's most of the questions that I had. Do you have any questions for me or anything else that you'd like our listeners to know?
I guess when I think about development projects, one of the points I guess I would like all your listeners to know is that development always seems to be a euphemism for destruction. So whenever people in the society talk about development, I always know there's going to be a cost to the natural world. There's going to be a cost to our animal and plant relatives. There's going to be a cost to the water. And I'd encourage people to think critically about that and to question those things, question that language.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great place to end it. We really appreciate you taking the time this morning. Thank you. It's a lot for us to continue to reflect on and hopefully put work in to show how much we appreciate the wisdom that you share.
We need money, land, solidarity. If you funny, stand very far away from me. We have running plans about as far as they can see to keep them coming. Bands building up the company. Shine